All right, so it's about 11:30. Is it okay if I get started? All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about documentation with Perl. A lot of this might seem like common sense, and a lot of it really is. But there are some things that we do as Perl developers that might be different from your experience with writing documentation for C code or Java code or just any other type of writing in general. So we're just going to kind of breeze through and look at some conventions that we like to stick to in our Perl documentation. And there's a lot of stuff you can do with lots of different types of documents we use in our Perl code. Like we have API documentations, tutorials, manuals, cookbooks. There's other types of documents too that we see when we're dealing with Perl. Like for example, there's FAQs. You can use the Perl doc utility to search through the core Perl FAQs. But we're going to focus more on what we do as writers, what we do when we're writing code for work or code that we might upload to CPAN. I'm sorry, forgive me, I'm having keyboard issues here. Sorry, bear with me just a moment. All right, this is embarrassing. So let me just try to carry on while I try to fix this. But basically, when we write Perl documentation, we write it in something called pod. Pod is basically, it's a really simple text-based markup. Everything in it deals with commands. All right, does anybody have any experience working with Linux and trying to get these dual monitor things working? No? The problem is I'm stuck in full screen on my browser and I can't get it over to this other display. Wait, there we go. I think I might have just... All right, let's try this again. There we go. All right, so as I was saying, pod, it's really simple markup. And again, appreciate your patience. But everything in pod basically looks like this. So whenever you want to tell... I'm sorry, say again? I can certainly try. There we go. So if you want any sort of if you want to tell pod what sort of element you're writing, you start with a command paragraph. Command paragraphs are anything that starts with this equals sign. So if I want to do a heading, I'll say equals head and then a number. The number 1 for a top level heading, number 2 for a second level heading. If I want to do verbatim paragraphs, like for example, if I just want to show a code snippet, I'll simply indent it with a little bit of space here. And then I can do other sorts of formatting. I can do bold, italics, and so on. It's all... There we go. So you can see here it is rendered out after we run it through some sort of a rendering thing. It's all pretty straightforward, though. And if you want, you can mix your pod with your code, or you can put it in a separate pod file. It just depends what you're trying to do. For example, if you're doing an API documentation where you're documenting each individual function in your API, there's a good chance you're going to want to mix it like this. So I'll be writing some code, and then I'll turn around and just start a command paragraph. And Perl and the pod parsers will both know that, hey, I'm done writing code now. Now I'm writing pod right here. Then when I'm done writing my pod, I can simply give it the cut command, and now it goes back to code. So that's really useful in an API documentation. If you're writing a full-page tutorial that's not necessarily mixed with code, maybe you'll just make a standalone pod file. But again, pod is really simple. I can trust that you all can go. You can open up the Perl pod document, and you can learn it in a few minutes. It's really straightforward. And if you download these slides, there's a link in here, and there's some other resources at the end of the presentation where I've got some links to some tutorials that'll walk you through that really quickly. So let's talk a little bit about conventions. Now, the easiest way to stick to the conventions and not have to worry about memorizing anything is just start with a tool like Module Starter or Module Setup. And these tools, what they'll do is they'll start you with some boilerplate for your module and your distribution that'll have a lot of pod already embedded in there. So it'll have all your basic sections that you need, and you just go and you fill in all the details. So it's a really simple way to get you started, not just for the pod, but also for the code and all the all the toolkit stuff you need as well. Now, when you're dealing with API documents, you're going to see a lot of different types of sections in those documents, and it's going to vary a lot depending upon what that API is for. So in general, the best advice anybody can ever give you about documentation is just trust your judgment. If you think your particular distribution doesn't need an incompatibilities section because it's not incompatible with anything, just simply omit it. It's really not a hard and fast science. But the ones I have in bold here, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but those are some of the more common ones. But again, those will be put into your documentation by the module starter or the module setup utilities, and that'll get you started right there anyway. But let's talk about a few of the common ones. For example, the name section, that's pretty straightforward. You put the name, but Perl people are a little bit picky about this, and recently there's a little more contention about it. But basically, you just put the name of your module with a dash, and then just a really short description. The synopsis. Synopsis is my favorite section. I think, this is my opinion, obviously, but in general, I think the synopsis is probably the most important thing you can put in your API documentation. The synopsis is the thing that you want to spend the most time and think the most about. And you want to assume that it's the only thing your users are going to read. And you should assume this for two reasons. One, it's going to force you to think more carefully about what you put in your synopsis. And then two, because maybe it actually will be the only thing people will read. So what you want in your synopsis specifically is you want a chunk of code that's really simple, really trimmed down, but hopefully, ideally, covers as much of your API as possible. So you want your synopsis to try to cover, I just threw these numbers in there, but try to cover 80 to 100% of your API. So any possible functions that your code does, have them shown, have them illustrated here in the synopsis. But you also want to keep the synopsis simple. Like, try to trim out any business-specific logic or anything that might confuse the readers. Just try to keep it as generic as possible. And I just pulled a simple example from Config Any, but you can look at any common module and you can see some examples of how a synopsis usually look. And in fact, that's something to keep in mind a lot when you're writing documentation is if you're ever in doubt, rule number one is always just trust your gut, write what you think you should write. But also, don't be afraid to just go search CPAN and go find some example modules and see what other people do. So just look at other people's examples and just try to follow suit. And then another pretty important section is the description section. That's going to have basically whatever you need it to have. It's going to have some additional background information. You can use it to tell your readers why they should use your module as opposed to some other one that does something similar. What makes yours different? What's the background story? Why did you write this code in the first place? What problems does it solve? So the description is kind of your background story to get the user started. And you can have a See Also section or where you can link to related modules. You can link to other sites. You can link to other documents. And you'll see there, I do L and then open bracket, close bracket. That's just a pod command for saying this is a link to something. And when you go and look at the pod tutorials, you'll find examples of how to link along with the other formatting commands like bold and italics and other common stuff. So far we've been talking mostly about these API documentations where we're going to have the name, the synopsis, the description. Here's a list of all the functions. they're very common. You're going to read these 100 times a day. They're very necessary, obviously. But it's not always enough. And in fact, I think too often we rely upon the API documentation. I think too often we say, well, I wrote this code. I gave you this API documentation that tells you how to use this. Now figure it out. Do what you want to do. But it really doesn't hurt us to go in and add additional types of documentation, like a tutorial. So you can write a document that's going to walk your users step by step through using this code. And usually tutorials are going to do something like start out with a very simple example, then we're going to build onto it layer by layer and go through the tutorial and build up the user's confidence in this code. But you can also do things like a cookbook where you have specific recipes. So you're going to say, given this problem, here's a cut and paste solution you can slap into your code to solve that problem. And this is more common in a very large code base where you've got a framework that can do a lot of stuff for you. The example you see here is DBX class. That's a very large database, library that can solve a lot of problems in a lot of different ways. So it makes sense for them to have a cookbook. But that's not to say you couldn't use it for a simpler thing. You can also have just generic manual type documents. And there's really no hard and fast rules for manuals. It can be whatever you need it to be. You might use it as a starting point where the user, before they read anything else, they come to the manual page. And maybe that's the page you're going to link to the API documentation. You're going to link to the tutorials. Maybe it's just going to be a few paragraphs of introduction. It really depends what you're trying to do. But if you're ever saying to yourself, I really want to write this particular guidance for the user, but I'm not sure what notch or what slot to slide it into, just create a manual namespace in your package and just stick it in there. So you might have your module : manual, and put whatever you need to put in there. And then once you've got all your documentation written, there's the most common way we look at that documentation is usually through the Perl, the Perl doc command, and that'll render it on your screen in plain text just fine. But there's plenty of other formats you can deal with. If you've ever looked at metacpan.org or search.cpan.org, you've seen people's pod rendered in HTML, but you can also render it in PDFs or LaTeX or whatever you need to. And again, if you download these slides, you can click these links and look at various types of rendering tools. The biggest and probably one of the most useful distributions right now for rendering pod in different formats is this Pod Simple library. They've got all kinds of different code in there for dealing with pod. And since we can deal with so many different formats, you can actually do conditional formatting in your documentation. So, for example, I can put a command in here that says, with this begin command, I can say, if you're dealing with HTML, I want you to show this image tag, and I want you to show my diagram. But if you're not dealing with HTML and you just have plain text, well, print out my highly technical ASCII diagram to compensate for that, at least so the user sees something instead of nothing. But it doesn't necessarily have to be... That's a very good question. And actually, let's look at this for a moment first. So if you, in this particular example, and this is from an HTML barcode rendering library, if you're looking at it in HTML, why not show this rendered barcode? It was made for HTML anyway. So in the HTML rendering, I show this barcode. But I didn't put an alternative format in there. I didn't tell the pod what to do for a text document or a PDF document or a LaTeX document. So in the text version, it's simply omitted. So does that answer your question? Okay. Well, basically, you choose how you want to format it. You choose whether you want to display alternates, or if you don't specify a particular format, it's going to simply omit it. That's provided you're in a command paragraph where you told it this is only for this particular type. So I gave it a command paragraph saying this is only for HTML, only show this during HTML. And that's good for value-added sort of stuff, things that aren't essential, but they're nice to see if it's available. And yeah, so finally, I want to take this time to just make a quick, very common sense note that it's very useful to try to encourage others to get involved in documentation. And I really want to point this out because we kind of have this mentality in the Perl. Well, I'd like to say that technical people in general seem to have this mentality that the author of the code, the person who created this work that we're documenting, is the expert. So therefore, they're the only person who can and should be writing the documentation. We have this mentality that, well, the author's the expert, therefore they're the best person, but I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true. There's a lot of reasons why you might not necessarily want the author to be writing and controlling all the documentation. The author might be too close to that code. They might take for granted some of the knowledge they have about it precisely because they are the expert. Like I might think, well, anybody's going to figure that out because obviously I know it really well, so everybody else will. But that's kind of a risky assumption to make because I don't know what other people's backgrounds or experiences are. So it's very good to get that external viewpoint on this. So other people who may want to contribute to that document, they might have different learning styles, different mental modes, different analogies, they might have different uses for the code that you never even thought of. So they can come in and help you write your documentation from a whole new perspective that you never even considered. So, just needless to say, it's really good to help others get involved in writing the documentation. So, let's flip that around for a second, and let's say if you're reading somebody else's documentation, you go to CPAN, you find some great library, some code that you want to use, you start reading through that documentation, and you find yourself scratching your head and you're saying, well, this is confusing. I'm having a hard time getting through this document. Take that big red flag, make yourself a note and say, this is hard, difficult, inappropriate documentation. And then once you get through that, once you figure out how to use that tool you're trying to use, go back if you have the time and clean up that documentation. Go back and fill in the gaps that you found. Say to yourself, well, what was missing from this document that could have made my life easier? And go in and just add that and send the author a patch. If you're the author, make it easy for people to send those patches. The tool that I really like, and I'm sure a lot of others do as well, is GitHub. It makes it so easy just to quickly make your changes, throw in a pull request, and then wash your hands and not have to worry about putting together a patch and emailing them and following up. And so just try to make it really easy to invite others to contribute to your documentation. But similarly, don't be intimidated about jumping in and helping with other people's documentation. Because I remember back when I first started writing Perl, and I would come across these big, large frameworks, and I'd say to myself, well, I don't know enough to contribute to that. I'm not an expert on this. They're the experts. I'm going to trust that their documentation is good enough. But that's not always true, and I don't think that's always fair. So even if you think that your contributions might not be the best possible, send them anyway. Write them anyway. If there's any deficiencies in the stuff that you submit or the stuff that you send, I guarantee you the author's going to go in and clean it up and tweak it and do what they need to do to make it more suitable. But that was the good catalyst, the good starting point, the push that author needed to clean up those mistakes or to expand the documentation to make it more useful to a wider audience. So, so I guess that's all I got. Any questions? All right. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely, and I do that at work every day. Well, not every day, but often actually. I'll write my pod, and then I'll use one of those Pod Simple plugins to take that pod and turn it into a wiki format. And then I'll just copy and paste it and drop it right into our work wiki. So that way we constantly have a wiki over here that the less technical people are more comfortable getting in and jumping into, and then we also have our pod in our Git repository. So yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I don't know offhand, but if nobody's written that yet, I'm sure it shouldn't be too difficult to do. Basically you'd have to start with a wiki parser, and then pod is really simple, so you can easily format. Once you have that parsed, it's easy enough to format into pod. So yeah, that's definitely reasonable. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, and thanks again for your patience with my computer ineptitude at the beginning there.